Hello and welcome to this session. Today's session is on recruitment and selection, Unit 2. And once again, I'm your tutor for this session, Dharam Gokul. Now, before we start our discussions on today's topic, let me make a recap of Unit 1. As you recall, we defined the concept of human resource management and reviewed its evolution. We also had a look at the different human resource management activities, objectives, roles, and the HRM models, namely the Michigan and Harvard models. And we also underlined the orientation of the human resource management function, which we said is becoming more strategic and is now being referred to as the strategic human resource management. Now, today's topic, recruitment and selection, will be dealt with in two parts. The first part will deal with human resource planning, and the second part will deal with recruitment and selection. I'm sure you had a look at the table of contents, and you must have noted that there is no mention of the human resource planning process. So I have brought a minor modification to the table of contents and have included the human resource planning process, which we are going to discuss. And as regards the recruitment and selection aspects, I shall be making a few amendments as we progress through Unit 2. So let's start with the human resource planning process. Now, I think we all agree that human resources constitute a very critical resource for organizations. And without the right people in the right number with the right KSAB, which means the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and the behaviors, the human resources being available at the right time, performing at the right standard, and achieving the right outcomes, organizations may find themselves in difficult situations. So the human resources are not only a critical resource for organizations, but they are also a very costly resource for organization. So it is extremely important that organizations pay a lot of attention to their human resource planning responsibility. Now, let us take a look at the terminologies, that is, the terms which are often used when discussions around the human resource planning function take place. This is what we call the semantic issue. So let's take a look at the terms which are often used in connection with the human resource planning process. First, we have the manpower planning terminology, or we could say the staffing planning. And then we have the human resource planning, HRP, employment planning, or resourcing. So what's the difference? Let's take a look at how these terms are defined. First, manpower planning. Manpower planning is the traditional approach to determining an organization's human resource requirements. It aims to reconcile an organization need for human resources with the available supply of human resources. Now, in contrast to manpower planning, you can also take a look at this definition where Bowie refers to manpower planning as an activity for coordinating the requirements for and the availability of different types of employees. Now, before we examine the human resource planning concept, let's take a closer look at manpower planning. Now, what it implies is that there is a matching exercise in terms of the demand for human resources and the supply of human resources. So essentially, it's an adjustment or a matching exercise of the numbers. That's why human manpower planning has often been referred to as a straightforward numerical exercise. And it focuses on the quantitative aspects, that is, the headcounts, the numbers. In contrast, human resource planning is viewed as a process, that is, a number of activities which are interconnected, and the human resource planning process takes on board the organization's current as well as future human resource requirements. But it also goes beyond, because it also takes into account the developmental aspect of the human resources and how the human resource plans will impact on the other human resource functions, so that all the human resource functions can contribute to the overall success of an organization. So, human resource planning is therefore a function where people considerations are always present. And as we've seen when we were discussing the concept of human resource planning, we argue that it is a strategic function. So human resource planning seeks to integrate the employee resource function at board level. That is, it has a voice, a say in determining the human resource requirements in line with the strategic plans of the organization. And therefore, we can say that human resource planning adopts a proactive approach to the determination of the human resource requirements, which is not the case with manpower planning, because manpower planning is more reactive. That is, the strategic plans have been finalized, and it's only subsequent to it that the human resource requirements are identified. Now, the human resource planning, therefore, is a process of determining the requirements or the needs for manpower for the present as well as for the future. Now, human resource planning also addresses the potential and developmental needs of employees with regard to issues like quality, commitment, productivity in the workforce. These are attitudinal, behavioral aspects which are not present in a typical manpower planning exercise. So when we take a closer look at human resource planning, it addresses two key concerns. One is in terms of the characteristics that should be present in the human resources, both in the immediate future, that is now, and in the long term. And in that respect, there is obviously a concern for the quantitative aspect. That is, we need to know the number, but human resource planning does not stop with the number, that is, headcounts. It goes beyond the quantitative aspect, that is the hard aspect of HRP, and takes on board the soft aspect, that is the qualitative, the behavioral aspects, that is those values, attitudes that the organization may be looking for in potential employees. So human resource planning is not only about headcounts, numbers, but it is also about counting heads, that is, ensuring that the organization has the quality human resources that are required to implement the strategic plans of the organization. Now, the second issue is to ensure that there are policies and manpower practices which support the human resource plan and facilitates the attraction, the retention, and the development of the human resources. We can therefore say that human resource planning addresses a wider range of issues than manpower planning. And these issues are quantity of human resources, quality of human resources, their deployment and their movement, that is, how these resources are allocated, how they are allocated, and also how they are transferred, they are promoted, how their career prospects are taken care of. So these are important issues which needs to be considered together with the external conditions, that is the market conditions, that is the labor market conditions. For example, which areas are scarcity areas, and how should the organization deal with its human resource requirements in case there is a shortage of skills in the labor market. The other important issue is the budget, the costs of implementing the human resource plans. And this will require a very careful analysis of the budgetary implications of human resource plans. So, like we can see, human resource planning addresses a broader range of issues on a longer term basis. Now, once we take into consideration the human resource planning process, we are therefore ensuring that the other HR functions will also be in line with the strategic plans of the organization. So, human resource planning constitutes a foundation activity. It is from the human resource plan that the plans for the other areas evolve. We can take a look at this diagram to illustrate the point. So we can see that we have the human resource planning process, which will enable the staffing, that is the recruitment and selection, to take place. Then we have the training and development activities, which can be organized, the performance management activities, and the issue of rewarding employees. All these different HR functions are connected to the human resource plan. And that's why the human resource planning process can be viewed as a foundation process for all other human resource activities of the organization. Now, let me suggest to you an activity which you can consider and which you can try to deal with at your own time. So the activity I'm proposing is the activity of human resource planning entirely different from manpower planning? Or put it more simply, is how far is human resource planning different from manpower planning? Okay, now let us take a look at the human resource planning process. Now, when we examine the human resource planning process, we can see that there are a number of activities, exercises that have to be carried out. Now, this process can be illustrated in the following diagram. You take a look at this diagram. You will see that there are broadly 4 important stages. The first stage is the interaction between the external environment of the organization and the internal environment. In fact, the interplay of the external environment and the internal environment set the stage for the strategic planning process and the human resource planning process. In a way, the interplay of the external environment and the internal environment, that is, the conditions prevailing in the external environment and the internal environment, have to be taken into consideration when embarking on the strategic planning process and the human resource planning process, and therefore the external environment conditions and the internal environmental conditions constitute the backdrop of the strategic planning process and the human resource planning process. So this is the first important stage. The second stage is the link between the strategic planning process and the human resource planning process. Now, at this stage, there is bound to be a lot of discussions, consultations, exchange of information as the process progresses. You may have a first stage, which we can call it as a preliminary stage, where information can be exchanged, moving on to a more elaborate stage, that is the intermediate stage, where the strategic plans and the human resource planning process are taken into account, and the different possibilities are examined. And once this stage is engaged, then the human resource planning team will have to move on to the third stage. And the third stage is about how the HR people will work out the details of the human resource plan. And this will involve the forecasting, projecting the human resource requirements, forecasting the human resource availability, and comparing the requirements and availability to determine whether the requirement match the availability, that is, demand is equal to supply, to determine whether there is a shortage of workers, or whether the organization is in a situation of surplus, that is, the supply is greater than the demand. And this stage will enable the organization to determine the possible courses of action. So if the requirements match the availability, then the organization doesn't have any steps to take, because there is no shortage and there's no surplus. But if there is a shortage of workers, then the organization will have to engage in recruitment and selection. Alternatively, if there is a surplus, then activities like retirement, layoff, redeployment will have to be considered. So this diagram highlights the four important stages that the human resource planning process normally goes through. And it also indicates that the human resource planning process is quite a complex, time-consuming exercise, and it needs the participation of different people at different levels of the organization, so as to be able to collect the needed information to arrive at certain estimates of the human resource requirements of the organization. A very elaborate and time-consuming exercise, which requires certain specific skills and competencies for the exercise to be undertaken. Now, in summary, the human resource planning process will require that the organizations conducts an inventory of its human resources to determine in terms of the profile of the workforce, in terms of the audit, that is how uh, optimally the human resources are being used by the organization. And all this information can be stored in the human resource information system so that whenever there is need for decision making, these information can be readily available. For example, when forecasting or projections have to be made, these information can be accessed through the human resource information system. The second important exercise is to make an analysis of the external labor market, that is scanning the external labor market conditions, which will in principle involve what is known as the SWOT analysis: strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat analysis. So when we have analyzed the internal labor market and external labor market, we are in a position to estimate what will be the demand and the supply of human resources for the organization. Now, to support the human resource planning process, we have to engage in forecasting, that is, projections, which will provide us with indications as to the supply and demand of human resources in the light of organizational objectives and strategies. Now, to conduct a forecasting exercise, there are a number of methods which can be adopted. Broadly, these methods are qualitative methods and quantitative methods. I shall present to you a list of the qualitative methods, namely the Delphi technique, brainstorming, committee method, expert opinion, and consultancy. And the quantitative methods are namely the trend analysis, regression correlation analysis, frequency distribution, and significance analysis, and the program evaluation and the review technique, as well as the critical path method. So these are methods, and you can look at these methods in more details. And in principle, a forecasting exercise would be using a combination of these methods to make projections of the availability and the demand for human resources for the organization. Now, apart from these qualitative and quantitative techniques, the organization may also use the following techniques. That is, to adopt either a top-down approach, that is, the organization will make projections from the top, and this information is trickled down to the lower levels of the organization, and there is some kind of obtaining some feedback from the different levels of the organization. Or the other technique could be the bottom up, that is, the different units or the different departments put forward their estimates of human resource requirements, and all these information are considered at the top level, and these information are used to make estimates of the requirement and the availability of the human resources of the organization. Now, we know that many organizations are now utilizing technology to support the HR function. So organization may also use software packages to support the human resource planning process. Now, essentially, therefore, a human resource planning exercise tries to indicate to the organization the demand, that is the requirements of human resources, both in qualitative and quantitative terms, and the available supply, that is, what are the possibility of acquiring the required human resources either from the external labor market or from the internal labor market. Now, we've come to a stage where the organization will go through the different stages of the human resource process, and at the end we will have a document which will be referred to as the human resource plan. Now, this human resource plan will be, as we said it earlier, will constitute the foundation for other human resource functions. So, to implement the human resource plan, the HR team will have to elaborate a number of plans which will flow from the human resource plan. Now, the different plans which will flow from the human resource plan will be known as, will be referred to as the operational plans. So let us take a look at what would be the different operational plans. We will have the recruitment and selection plan to show how many and what type of people is required and when they are needed. The redeployment plan, that is the movement of employees in terms of training, in terms of transfers, in terms of promotions, in terms of retirement. The redundancy plan, which will indicate whether we have a surplus of human resources and what needs to be done with the surplus. The training plan, that is where training is needed and who are the employees who should be provided training and how the training will have to be organized, as well as the budget that has to be provided for the training plan to be implemented. We can also have a productivity plan, that is how to ensure that the organization is improving its productivity by reducing costs, or where the organization can adopt new technology and improve on the productivity of the different operations. And also consider how to negotiate with employees so that the organization and the employee can both be in a situation of win-win, so that productivity can increase and both the organization and the employees can benefit from the productivity gains. The retention plan, that is, what needs to be done, or what type of decisions which needs to be taken to ensure that people who have joined the organization and who have been trained and do not leave the organization. So, in a sense, how to avoid wastage. Because if we don't have a retention plan, and when employees are leaving the organization, this can be a cause for disruption of the activities of the organization. So, as we have seen, human resource planning is a fairly complex exercise. It is more elaborate than a typical manpower planning exercise, and the human resource plan takes into account the current and future needs of the organization. It has a developmental perspective. It is a plan that enables the other HR functions to be elaborated and implemented, so that the organization is able to derive optimum benefits from its human resources. So, to conclude, let me say that we stated it at the beginning: human resources are a critical resource, and it is very important that when decisions are being made about the human resources, that the organization has the right number of people with the right KSAB, that is knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors, and they are assigned the right tasks, assigned the right roles and responsibilities, and they perform as per the expectation of the organization, and that the goals and objectives of the organizations are achieved in the best conditions and in the most optimal manner. So this brings us to the end of our presentation and discussion on human resource planning. You have a website you can visit and gain some more information on the issue of human resource planning. So I hope that you have obtained, you have had an understanding of the human resource planning process and the different stages of the process, and why it is such an important function for organizations. So let me thank you for your attention, and until we meet for our next session, goodbye. Thank you.